This is Mises Weekends with your host, Jeff Deist.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to our Mises Weekend. So as you can see, we're joined by an old friend, Jim Bovard. I'm sure a lot of you know his name from over the years, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, among other. And of course, he's written some great books of his own. But most recently, you'll probably know his name from both The Hill and USA Today, where he is a featured columnist. And Jim, it's good to see you. How you doing?
Okay, doing good. Hey, Jeff, thanks for having me back on the program. It's always fun.
Well, as our title today indicates, we're talking about this damnable topic, the politicization of America. And I thought you were a perfect guest because you've been in and around Washington, D.C., in and around public policy, in and around the administrative state for so many years. And, you know, Jim, these Kavanaugh hearings, they're bringing it home. Obviously, Trump has been the culmination of something very ugly in America in a lot of ways. But this Kavanaugh hearing, this really seems like we've sort of ratcheted it up, and there's sort of a new low in how the two teams in tribal America are determined to see this thing, i.e. what Kavanaugh might have done 30 years ago at a teenage party.
Yeah, well, it's disappointing to me because I was hoping this process would help restore faith in the government and in the Supreme Court, but it doesn't seem to be working out that way.
Yeah, I'm sure that was a great hope of yours.
It's fascinating how this has become like an onion, and we're peeling off layer after layer of BS. And about an hour before this was taped, the lawyers for Ford out in California suddenly announced, well, she's willing to testify, but Monday is arbitrary, unlike the other 6 days of the week. And I want to be clear. We don't know the facts of the matter, and if Kavanaugh did, sexually assault her and lie about it, that's a horrendous crime. But they haven't given us much to chew on aside from her declaration, which she won't even swear to. So, but you were talking about the tribal warfare of the two parties. What's fascinating to me is how easily this turned into a tribal warfare of the two genders, especially on a lot of the feminist activists are kind of, trying to have are talking and writing as if there is collective guilt by all men, because some guys are bastards. A lot of guys have done crap in the past and gotten away with it. Therefore, okay, here's one. Let's tar and feather him.
Right. And he's also a privileged white guy, went to apparently a prep school in Washington, D.C., he went to some Ivy League colleges. So if he doesn't become Supreme Court justice, boo-hoo, he'll still be okay. This is the kind of thinking that we're stuck with apparently now.
Yeah, and I mean, it's been disappointing to me that there wasn't more focus on Kavanaugh being a baseball fan, because I thought that was sufficient to disqualify him. But it's fascinating to see the standards of evidence being used here, especially by a lot of the supporters of Christine Ford, because all these memes on Twitter and elsewhere, like, I believe her. Well, it would help if she knew what year it was. Yeah. And I mean, it's so basic. And maybe if she was assaulted, I hope that justice can be done. But she's given us so little information, and yet there's the sanctimony and the push button hatred is jaw dropping.
But what's odd here, or what's unsettling here, is that the things we ought to be focusing on as liberty-minded people is that it turns out he's particularly bad on presidential authority. He's particularly bad on the Fourth Amendment. He's particularly bad on surveillance and wiretaps. He's particularly bad on torture. He's particularly bad on FISA court issues. And all of this is almost, it won't even be considered. It's beyond the scope of the conversation.
Well, yeah, I mean, those are grave issues, and those are reasons he should not have been nominated. I mean, there was a female judge, Barrett, who would be a lot better, and she's more independent, and she's untainted. And Trump would have been far smarter to go with her, and to make for a much better Supreme Court. It's disappointing that the issues that you raised had no sticking point in D.C. aside from Judge Knapp and about three other people. Maybe a few people in the Hill pissed and moaned about it, but most of the Democrats were attacking Kavanaugh for other reasons,
Right.
and most of the GOP supporters are either cheerleaders or are complicit in the same thing. It's fascinating how the ethics record of the George W. Bush administration has gotten whitewashed. There was a guy, Richard, is it Painter, who was a Senate candidate up in Minnesota, and he was touting himself as the chief ethics legal officer in the Bush White House. How the hell did that did not disqualify him from any appearance in civilized life? I don't know, but Kavanaugh was apparently tight with John Yoo, or at least he knew him and had no objections. John Yoo should be a poison pill.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Yeah, and here's the thing: is that both sides, and I think somewhat fairly so, view the Supreme Court as a life and death matter. You've got these 9 monarchs; they're appointed for life. In that sense, they have more power than a president. So once we swallow the idea that the Supreme Court makes laws for us, top-down laws, then we're forced to care about the Supreme Court, whether because it cares about us.
Yeah, Thomas Jefferson had some wonderful lines about he was horrified to see how much power the Supreme Court was capturing early in the nation's history. It's interesting. A lot of folks, there's been some excellent articles on Mises about how this is indicative of the Supreme Court having too much power. It's also indicative of how the entire government is far too domineering over the American people. And watching the fights back and forth, especially over the last week, it struck me that statism makes people stupid, because people are using standards of evidence in this case that few people would use in their daily lives for people who they knew, unless they were really angry at their spouse.
Right. Right. It becomes a sense where the ends justify the means, because we're in a war, and war has winners and losers. It has spoils. And when you're in a war, you don't much care about whether things are fair or just or according to or comport with a particular process that we'd like to think of as the rule of law. It just becomes win.
Yeah, and to take a parallel to that, there was a wonderful line from one of the Godfather movies in which the Godfather devised, "Never hate your enemies, it affects your judgment." And there's so much hatred out there. It's pouring in the streets at this point. It's pouring out in Capitol Hill at this point. And, folks don't realize that basically once you start chanting and thrusting your fist in the air, your objectivity is not so good.
Well, Murray Rothbard has this great quote from 1970 where he talks about, under socialism, all life becomes politicized. And
Yep.
it feels like as America gets more and more statist, more and more collectivist, that this is just a new feature. This is just a new reality in America, that we have to look through everything through this lens of race and gender and politics and power and patriarchy, and that this is how things are going to be going forward.
Well, if that's true, it's going to get a heck of a lot uglier, and it's already surprising how ugly it's become.
Yeah.
People using these lenses, it's just amazing how much the sense of righteousness and the sense of collective guilt on the other side of the barricades. And as I said earlier, there are a lot of guys who are bastards who got away with a lot of bad stuff in the past, and if there's a way to charge them, fine. But this whole notion that a mere accusation, not even tied to a year or a place, is sufficient. It's like, what next?
Yeah. But how is this happening? Why are things so political when, if we really look at the two major parties, which are now run by neoconservatives and neoliberals, there's not a lot of difference between them at all in terms of policy, and especially not just stated policy, but actually enacted laws. I'm not sure that from a purely legislative perspective, that the Donald Trump administration is doing things all that differently than a Hillary Clinton administration would do things. We're still in Syria. We're still in Iraq. We're still in Afghanistan. We're still in Yemen. Okay, taxes and regulations might have been cut slightly, but other things have increased. They're both bad on monetary policy. So this is overwhelmingly about tone. It's overwhelmingly about tenor, and it's overwhelmingly about race and gender and identity as opposed to actual policy differences. So how does this become such a war when there's not a dime's worth of difference at the end of the day?
Yeah, some good points you make, but to take a couple steps back, I think if Hillary had been elected, that instead of having these stupid bases in Syria, that we might be actively trying to topple the Assad regime. We might have done more aggressive action against Iran. We probably have a hell of a lot more conflict with Russia, and who knows how that would play out. Trump has done a huge number of stupid and unjust things on foreign policy. We've killed a lot of innocent people abroad under his reign. I think that there's an attitude, maybe I'm reaching for straws here, but it's healthy to see an open conflict between the White House and some of the most powerful federal agencies like the FBI and CIA. And that might be one of the legacies of Donald Trump. I mean, it's encouraging that Trump is encouraging a lot of people to doubt or question the FBI claims that never would have questioned them before. I don't recall Ronald Reagan doing that, and Richard Nixon certainly didn't. So it's not a reason to trust Trump, but it's possible that out of some of these wars, it's a little bit like with the wars of the Reformation, horrendous things, but out of that came, more of a space for individuals to live their own lives.
Yeah, and I noticed, though, that while we're busy worrying about talking about a teenage party that Brett Kavanaugh may or may not have attended, in the meantime, Jim, look what goes on. So the DOD appropriations bill was just passed by the Senate. It's $675 billion, more of the same. It was 93-7 was the vote. Fortunately, I see that Rand Paul and Mike Lee voted no on it. But I mean, it's just amazing that while we're preoccupied with this stuff that triggers us emotionally, the actual dark side, the nitty gritty of almost $1 trillion, really, when you get into all the State Department funding, et cetera, beyond just the DOD appropriations, but the almost $1 trillion we spend a year on mucking about with the rest of the world goes unquestioned, almost unnoticed.
Yeah, it's frustrating. Okay, there's a lot of attention right now on whether or not there was an assault at a party in Montgomery County, Maryland, sometime in the early 1980s. But in the last few weeks, the U.S. has probably been involved in drone strikes that have killed a lot of innocent teenagers, male, female, whatever. I mean, there's a lot of carnage which we're unleashing, but it almost never has a human face. And because it doesn't have a human face, people, pay attention to the Supreme Court hubbub and the end of the baseball season.
Yeah, I know, you've been around some of the administrations in Washington over the years. It's interesting if you read Bob Novak, the late Bob Novak, the Prince of Darkness, as he used to be called. He really identifies Watergate, the Watergate era, as when Washington changed irrevocably. It went from kind of a sleepy backwater where members of both parties and both chambers and the various administrations would kind of get along and have a code between them, to something where things started to become politicized and people became suspicious of one another. Now, as libertarians, of course, we think the whole thing's a bit of a charade, but it's interesting to me, as someone who does have an interest in politics, to think of Watergate as a watershed moment. Of course, now we look back on that, Jim, and